Stop whatever you are doing right now, because what is happening in Washington and on Wall Street is not a political story. It is a direct financial attack on your savings, your mortgage, your retirement, and your future. And the overwhelming majority of Americans have absolutely no idea it is already underway. President Trump has just pulled the trigger on what I am calling the second largest economic stimulus in the history of the United States of America. And unlike the stimulus checks that went directly into your bank account with your name on them, this one is completely invisible to the naked eye. There are no checks being mailed. There are no press conferences celebrating it. There is just a quiet, calculated restructuring of the most powerful financial institution on the planet. And when the dust settles, one group of people will have gotten dramatically wealthier. And another group of people, the ones who are not paying attention, will have funded the entire operation with their own money without ever being asked permission. So I'm going to tell you exactly what is happening, exactly what it means for your money, and exactly what you need to do about it. Not because I want to scare you, but because the numbers demand that you wake up right now. Before we go any further, I need you to subscribe to this channel immediately, and I do not say that lightly. What you are about to learn over the next 25 minutes took me decades of investing, millions of dollars in hard lessons, and more hours studying economic history than most people spend in a college career. I am handing it to you completely free of charge, and the only price of admission is that you hit that subscribe button, so that when the next major shift happens, and it will, you are already positioned to hear about it before the mainstream media gets around to explaining it 3 months too late. Subscribe now, or accept that you will be the last one to know. Let me start by destroying one of the most dangerous myths in American financial life, because until you understand this, nothing else I am about to tell you will make sense. Most Americans believe the Federal Reserve Bank is a government institution, a safe, boring, bureaucratic arm of the United States government that carefully manages the economy and the public interest. That belief is completely and demonstrably wrong, and the Fed's own website will confirm it if you bother to read it. The Federal Reserve is not federal, meaning the United States government does not own it, control it, or direct it. It is not a reserve, meaning it is not sitting on a pile of cash somewhere waiting to be deployed. And it is not a bank in any sense that you or I would recognize, because you cannot walk in and open a checking account. What it actually is the single most powerful financial entity on the planet, an institution that can set the interest rate at which money flows through the entire American economy, and that can quite literally create money out of nothing by printing it. Those are two extraordinary powers, and they have been sitting in the hands of Chairman Jerome Powell, a man that President Trump has publicly, repeatedly, and furiously disagreed with over the direction of interest rates. But here's the single most important piece of information you need to understand about everything that follows. Jerome Powell's term as chairman of the Federal Reserve expires on May 15th, and President Trump, as the sitting president of the United States, gets to appoint the next chairman. He has chosen a man named Kevin Warsh. That appointment is not a footnote in a financial news article. That appointment is the opening move in an economic strategy so large in scale that the last time anything comparable happened in this country was in the aftermath of World War II. Kevin Warsh is not being appointed to maintain the status quo. He is being appointed because President Trump has made it publicly, unambiguously clear that he expects lower interest rates and that he would not have selected someone who was not aligned with that objective. This is not speculation. Trump said it in plain English. There is not much doubt in his mind that interest rates are going to be lowered. The Federal Reserve has 12 voting members, and now the President of the United States has placed his chosen man at the head of that table. The machinery is in motion. Now let me bring this out of the abstract and put it directly into your wallet with cold, hard numbers, because this is where most financial commentary completely fails the average person. They talk about interest rates like they are an academic concept, when in reality they are the difference between you being able to afford your life or not. Let us take a straightforward example that millions of Americans can relate to right now. You want to buy a $500,000 house? You do the responsible thing and put 20% down. That is $100,000 of your own money, your savings, your sacrifice. You finance the remaining $400,000 with a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage. At today's rate of 7%, your monthly mortgage payment is $2,661 every single month for 30 years. That is a real number that is shutting real people out of homeownership right now, which is exactly why the average age of a first-time homebuyer in America has climbed all the way to around 40 years old. Now watch what happens when rates move. If the Federal Reserve cuts rates and mortgages fall to 5.5%, your monthly payment drops to $2,271. If rates fall further to 4.5%, your payment drops to approximately $2,026 per month. That is a savings of more than $630 every single month, over $7,500. $100 every single year on the exact same house, the exact same loan, just a different interest rate. So that is the power that is being repositioned right now, and Trump is not waiting for the Fed to act on its own schedule. He has already directed Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to go into the market and purchase $200 billion in mortgage-backed securities, a direct, deliberate intervention designed to start pushing mortgage rates lower before Warshak even takes a seat. But here is where I need you to think like an investor and not like a consumer, because lower mortgage rates are not a simple gift with no strings attached. Between 2020 and 2021, when rates hit historic lows, 14 million Americans refinanced their mortgages and pulled approximately $460 billion in cash equity out of their homes. That money entered the economy. People spent it on renovations, on cars, on vacations, on everything except saving and investing it wisely. Now we are sitting in 2026 with housing prices that have risen roughly 50% over the prior 6 years in many markets, with millions of homeowners sitting on substantial equity and paying mortgage rates of 6.5%, 7%. If rates fall significantly, the refinancing boom will happen again. Only this time it will be larger. More equity, more homeowners, more cash pulled out, more spending injected into the economy. Companies like Home Depot and Lowe's have been publicly pleading with the Federal Reserve to cut rates aggressively because they know exactly what happens when people suddenly have cheap access to their home equity. They remodel, they renovate, and they spend. But the risk hiding inside that opportunity is this. If mortgage rates fall and more buyers flood the market, the supply of homes for sale does not increase proportionally. You now have greater demand competing for the same inventory, which triggers bidding wars, which drives prices higher, which makes the inflation problem that is already a serious concern even worse. This is not a simple equation with a clean answer, and anyone telling you it has something to sell you, I want you to understand something fundamental about how the American economy actually functions. Because without this understanding, you will continue to make financial decisions based on feelings rather than mechanics. Our economy does not run on innovation, it does not run on productivity, it does not run on virtue or hard work, though those things matter at the individual level. At the macro level, the American economy runs entirely on one thing: spending velocity minus the speed and volume at which money changes hands. When you spend money, that money becomes someone else's income. That someone else then spends it, and it becomes a third person's income. Every dollar that stops moving is a dollar that stops growing the economy, which is why every president in modern American history has had one overriding economic objective, regardless of their political party: keep the spending going. Now, apply that understanding to what happens when mortgage rates fall. More people can afford to buy homes. More home purchase transactions close. More real estate agents collect commissions. More mortgage bankers close loans. More title companies process transfers. More furniture stores sell bedroom sets. More contractors get hired to do repairs and upgrades. Each one of those transactions puts money into someone's pocket, and that person then spends a portion of it somewhere else. And the cycle compounds. That is the stimulus mechanism, and it is deliberately being engineered right now through the Federal Reserve appointment. But the economic lever goes even deeper than new home purchases because of what happens when the roughly 66% of Americans who already own homes are sitting on large amounts of built-up equity and suddenly find themselves able to refinance at a dramatically lower rate. History tells us with brutal consistency what most of those people do. They do not save the extra cash flow. They do not invest it in index funds. They spend it. They renovate their kitchens. They pay off credit card debt. They buy new vehicles. They take vacations. All of that spending enters the economic bloodstream and pushes GDP higher. This is the spending boom that the Trump administration is engineering, and it is exactly why this qualifies as the second largest stimulus in American history, despite the fact that no check with your name on it will ever arrive in your mailbox. The problem, and this is the part that demands your full, undivided attention, is that there is no such thing as a free economic lunch. Every time the government or the Federal Reserve engineers a spending boom through lower interest rates and increased money creation, the bill comes due in the form of inflation. More dollars chasing the same goods means each dollar is worth less, which means prices rise, which means your salary buys less, your savings are worth less, and your standard of living erodes, even as the economic headline numbers look healthy. The fundamental dilemma is this: you can fight a slowing economy by cutting rates and printing money, or you can fight inflation by raising rates and restricting money creation. You absolutely cannot do both at the same time. The Trump administration is choosing to fight the slowing economy, which means inflation is the price you will pay. And the question is not whether you will pay it, it is whether you are positioned to profit from it or simply absorb it. Now, I'm going to show you the real reason behind all of this. The reason that has nothing to do with your mortgage and everything to do with the survival of the United States government's own financial position. Because what I am about to show you in the numbers will reframe everything you thought you understood about why interest rates matter. The United States government has one primary source of revenue: your tax dollars. In 2026, the government expects to collect approximately $5 trillion in federal tax revenue. That is an enormous sum of money, and yet the government is expected to spend approximately $7 trillion in 2026, meaning there's a $2 trillion gap between what comes in and what goes out every single year. That $2 trillion gap is covered entirely by borrowing, by going further into debt, by running the national credit card up to a higher limit year after year without any credible plan to pay it off. The cumulative result of decades of this behavior is that the United States now carries approximately $39 trillion in national debt. Let that number sit in your mind for a moment. $39 trillion. Now here is where it gets dangerous for your money specifically. The fastest growing expense in the entire federal budget right now is not the military. It is not healthcare. It is not Social Security. It is the interest payments on that $39 trillion of debt. And in 2026, those interest payments are expected to reach approximately $1 trillion for the year. $1 trillion just in interest on a government that only collects $5 trillion in taxes. That means 20 cents of every dollar you pay in federal taxes is not funding your healthcare, not funding infrastructure, not funding national defense, not funding anything that benefits you directly. It is simply being handed over to the holders of U.S. government debt as a payment for past spending decisions that you had no vote on. Now, do you understand why Trump is so aggressively pushing for lower interest rates? If the Federal Reserve cuts rates by even 1 percentage point, the United States government saves hundreds of billions of dollars per year in interest costs on that $39 trillion debt. That is not a rounding error. That is a budget transformation. And here is where history becomes your most valuable teacher, because we have been here before, and the playbook that was used to get out of it will shock you with its audacity. In 1946, after the United States had gone deeply into debt to finance World War II and pull itself out of the Great Depression, America's national debt stood at approximately $271 billion against a GDP of $222 billion, putting the debt to GDP ratio at approximately 121%, meaning the country owed more than its entire annual economic output. Sound familiar? It should, because today our debt to GDP ratio sits at approximately 130% worse than post-World War II. By the numbers, in 1946, the government did not cut spending to solve the debt crisis. Let me be completely clear about that, because it is the most important thing I will say in this entire video. They did not spend less. They did not balance the budget. They did not pay down the debt. Instead, the government and the Federal Reserve implemented a strategy called financial repression, which had two defining characteristics. First, they set interest rates artificially low, lower than the actual inflation rate, which meant that anyone lending money to the U.S. government was guaranteed, mathematically, to lose purchasing power on their investment. Second, the government created regulatory structures, laws, and institutional incentives that effectively pushed banks, pension funds, insurance companies, and ordinary savers to lend money to the government anyway, even at those loss-generating rates, because the alternative, not lending to the government, was made more painful through regulatory pressure and the lack of other sanction options. By 1974, when financial repression ended, the national debt had actually grown from $271 billion to $475 billion. It did not shrink. It grew, but the economy had grown dramatically faster, from $222 billion to approximately $1.5 trillion in GDP. That collapsed the debt to GDP ratio from 121% all the way down to approximately 25%. They did not eliminate the debt. They inflated their way out of the debt's relative weight by growing the economy faster than the debt grew, using cheap borrowed money injected relentlessly into the economic system. The savers of that era got crushed. The investors of that era got wealthy. And right now, in 2026, with a debt to GDP ratio of 130%, a newly appointed Federal Reserve chairman aligned with the president's desire for lower rates and inflation already running hot, Every single condition required for financial repression round 2 is either already present or actively being constructed. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is a documented historical pattern being repeated with modern instruments. Let me now give you 5 specific areas where this environment creates actionable opportunity. Because my entire purpose in delivering this information is not to make you afraid, it is to make you dangerous as an investor, and dangerous investors do not sit in cash and pray. They identify the structural shifts, a position ahead of the crowd, and collect the wealth that gets transferred away from the passive and the ignorant. The first area is real estate. The mathematical relationship between mortgage rates and housing demand is one of the most reliable correlations in all of American economic history. When rates fall, housing activity rises, and the companies that service that activity profit. You do not need to go out and buy a physical property to get exposure to this trend. Through the stock market, you can invest in an ETF like VNQ, Vanguard's U.S. Real Estate ETF, which gives you broad, diversified exposure across the entire American real estate sector. If you want more targeted exposure to the companies that actually build the houses that lower rates, will make more people want to buy. You can look at XHB or ITB, both of which focus specifically on home builders and home construction companies. When rates fall and demand for new housing construction rises, these companies are directly in the path of that money flow. The second area is gold, and I want to be precise about how I think about gold, because a naive view of gold will cost you money. Gold is not an investment in the traditional sense. It produces no earnings, pays no dividend, and creates no economic value while you hold it. What gold is a monetary insurance policy against the devaluation of the dollar. When governments print money and inflate away the value of their currency, gold holds its purchasing power relative to that currency, which means it appears to rise in price measured in devalued dollars. If the financial repression scenario plays out, low rates, high inflation, aggressive money printing, gold is exactly where some portion of your capital belongs as a hedge. You can get paper exposure through GLD without the storage and security concerns of physical metal. The third area is Treasury inflation-protected securities, known as TIPS. These are bonds issued by the United States government where the interest rate you receive is not fixed. It adjusts upward as inflation rises, protecting your real purchasing power. In a financial repression environment, where inflation is deliberately running above the interest rate on conventional bonds, TIPS offer a mechanism to at least partially keep pace. You can access these through SCHP, which is Schwab's TIPS ETF, giving you diversified exposure without having to buy individual bonds. The fourth area is broad American equity exposure through the S&P 500. Because if the financial repression strategy works as intended, if lower rates genuinely stimulate enough economic activity to grow GDP faster than debt grows, the companies that make up the American economy will generate more revenue, more earnings, and more shareholder value. The S&P 500 is the 500 largest publicly traded companies in America, accessible through ETFs like SPY, and it has historically been one of the most powerful long-term wealth creation vehicles available to ordinary investors, precisely because when one company struggles and exits the index, it is automatically replaced by a stronger one. You get the benefit of continuous quality filtering without doing any work. The fifth area is international diversification, because one of the risks of financial repression is that it weakens the dollar relative to the currencies of countries that are not engaged in the same monetary behavior. If the dollar loses value, assets denominated in foreign currencies become worth more in dollar terms, which means international equity exposure can act as a natural currency hedge for developed market economies. Europe, Japan, Australia, Canada, VIA gives you broad exposure. For higher risk, higher potential return exposure to emerging markets, India, China, Brazil, Southeast Asia, VW provides that access. These are not guarantees. Investing always carries risk, and you will lose money at some point. That is not a possibility. It is a certainty. If you invest long enough, what separates the investor from the victim is whether you have done the work to understand why you own what you own and what conditions would change your thesis. I'm going to close with this, and I want you to hear it clearly. There are exactly 2 types of people watching this video right now. The first type is going to close this video, go back to their regular routine, continue paying their mortgage at whatever rate the market dictates, continue holding cash that inflation is quietly eating alive, continue watching their purchasing power erode month after month while wondering why life keeps getting more expensive even though they are working harder than ever, and they are going to do all of that without ever understanding that the system is not broken, It is working exactly as designed, and they are the ones it is designed to extract value from. The second type is going to treat this information as the weapon it is going to take the time to understand the financial repression playbook, is going to make deliberate, informed decisions about where their capital is positioned before May 15th marks the beginning of a new monetary era, and is going to be on the right side of the largest wealth transfer that this generation of Americans will ever witness. You do not get to be the second type by accident. You get there by making a conscious, deliberate decision right now to treat your financial education as the most important investment you will ever make. Because every other investment you make will be shaped by what you know and what you do not know. Subscribe to this channel, share this video with one person in your life who you believe is smart enough to do something with this information, and understand that the stimulus has already been triggered. The only question left is whether you will profit from it or pay for it.